These talks will also be available on the parish website for the duration of Lent. Tonight our speaker is Monsignor Richard Liddy of Seton Hall University. Monsignor Richard Liddy has had a long and happy affiliation with Seton Hall and the Immaculate Conception Seminary for 70 years. He entered Seton Hall Prep in 1952 and graduated from the university in 1960. He then went to Rome to prepare for the priesthood and was ordained in Rome in 1963. Monsignor came back to New Jersey and was assigned to teach philosophy at Immaculate Conception Seminary. This resulted in his return back to Rome to obtain his PhD in philosophy, which he earned in 1970. In his studies, Monsignor was greatly influenced by his teacher, the Jesuit philosopher Bernard Lonergan. Lonergan is considered one of the great theological philosophers of the 20th century. Monsignor founded the Lonergan Institute at Seton Hall in 2006. Eventually, Monsignor was appointed as the rector and dean of Immaculate Conception Seminary and School of Theology. In 1984, he went back to Rome to become the spiritual director at North American College. And during that time, he worked on the cause for the canonization of John Henry Newman, about whom he will speak tonight. Monsignor attended the canonization of John Henry Newman on October 13th, 2019. In 1990, Monsignor Liddy was named as the interim chancellor at Seton Hall University, and he has taught in the Religious Studies Department and founded the Center for Catholic Studies at Seton Hall. Monsignor also sat on the bench and was the chaplain for the Seton Hall basketball team for several years. Monsignor has written numerous articles on the works of Bernard Lonergan, G.K. Chesterton, and St. John Henry Newman. Tonight, Monsignor Liddy will discuss From Lent Through Easter with John Henry Newman. Please welcome Monsignor Richard Liddy.
In some circles, I'm more famous for being the basketball chaplain. And anyway, St. Peter's run this year was exciting to watch. But I'm delighted to speak to you. I enjoy coming to St. Catharine's and St. Margaret's on Sunday and celebrating the Eucharist with you. It's just a delight to come to this parish. So I've been working on Cardinal Newman for a while. Maybe I could just say a couple of things about how I got interested in John Henry Newman. I happened to cross the book of his when I was a young seminarian, a book about him by a man named Louis Boyer called The Spirituality of John Henry Newman. And it's N-E-W-M-A-N. There is a St. John Neumann, who was the first bishop of Philadelphia in the early 1800s. And this is John Henry Newman. I'll talk a little bit about him, and then afterwards some of the implications of his spirituality. John Henry Newman was born in London in 1801, and he was born in an Anglican family, Episcopalian family. And he had his family of 6 children. His father was a banker, and he was very precocious, very intelligent young man, and a leader among his fellow students. And early on, he learned to play the violin, so music was always very important to him. And we'll play a famous poem that he wrote, Lead Kindly Light. We'll play that on YouTube version of that, folk choir from Notre Dame at the end. But let me lead up to that. He was, as I say, he was born in 1801, and he went to the public school nearby, and eventually he went to Oxford. As a young man, he went to Oxford and studied there, and Oxford had a great influence on him. But at the age of 15, in 1816, he had a religious conversion, a very famous religious conversion, and I'll read his description of it, and it can give you a feeling for his life. Let's see. I have to get my papers straight here. Oh, here we are. He says this. He wrote a biography of his life called the Apologia Pro Vita Sua, and it's a classic of English literature. James Joyce said he was the best writer of English that he knew in the English language. So that was quite a compliment from James Joyce. And Newman became a saint. James Joyce did not become a saint. But he appreciated someone who could write English and write it very well. Beautiful English. And his writing had a musical theme to it often. His words were musical. And that's why he wrote several classics. One of the classics that he wrote was The Idea of a University. And recently I read, someone said it's the fundamental book about the nature of a university, written by John Henry Newman after he became a Catholic. But just to give you an idea of his background, I mentioned he was a very precocious young man. At the age of 15, he was at school during the summer, and his father's bank had gone bankrupt. So the family was in, trouble, and they had to move from their house, and the 6 children, and he was left at school, and he was ill. But he began to read, and he made the acquaintance with an evangelical minister by the name of Walter Mayer. And this minister gave him some books to read. And he says this: "When I was 15, in the autumn of 1816, a great change of thought took place in me. I fell under the influence of a definite creed and received into my intellect impressions of dogma, which through God's mercy has never been effaced or obscured." So it's you might say, a very intellectual description of a conversion. He was 15, but he said later on in his life, he said, "I am more sure that God reached into my life at that early age than that I have hands or feet." So eventually he was to become a Catholic. But what happened to him as a young man was really the basic turning point in his life, where he really turned to God. And the rest of his life, you might say, was a converting, a changing, being willing to take chances and to do things that, made him a saint and made him a famous person, famous writer. So it's difficult to overestimate the significance of this first conversion in Newman's life. It focused his sight on things Christian and set him on the way to personal holiness. Holiness before peace became one of the key sayings in his life. And despite his brilliance, the major theme of his later preaching was the priority of religious and moral virtue to intellectual excellence. So, just a couple of things about that early conversion. As he says, he frames it in very intellectual ways. He said, I received into my intellect a definite creed. So the three things that he said characterized his early life were dogma, in other words, clear belief, and sacraments, that we meet God in the sacraments of the church. As Catholics, we believe that we meet him in the Eucharist. We meet him in the community of faith. So those two elements are important. The importance of intellect and the importance of the sacramental church. And the third element he said that he picked up as an early young man was anti-Catholicism. That was the third thing. So he said, I had a stain on my imagination. I didn't like Catholics, and I thought they weren't really Christians. And he said, I kept that stain stayed with me until my 40s. Before that, he said, using my head, I began to see the importance of the Catholic faith. So anyway, at a young age, he went up to Oxford, and he eventually went to Oriel College in Oxford. And years later, he'd write a book, The Idea of a University, and it really was his experience of university life at Oxford that set the tone for not only what he would write years later, The Idea of a University, but also his becoming a Catholic. He said that the university is where you meet people and you share ideas and you meet in small groups. And he talks about the mentors that he had. A man named Whately, Edward Whately, or Richard Whately. And he said, he taught me to think for myself and to see for myself and to walk with my own 2 feet. Very interesting. That this older man, his influence on John Henry Newman. Eventually, they were to have disagreements, but he also met others who became, dear friends and deep friends, people more his own age. A man named Keble, John Keble, who was a poet, and a man named Harold Froude, who became a dear friend, who knew a lot of history. And he said, Froude told me to look back beyond the Reformation to the medieval Christianity, to medieval Catholicism. And he said eventually the friends that he met at Oxford were the fathers of the church, the great writers like Augustine and Clement and Origen. He said, I dedicated myself to reading about the early church and then comparing the church that he saw around him at the time. And that, the fathers, years later, he said, Catholics didn't make me a Catholic. The fathers made me a Catholic. And then someplace else he wrote, Oxford made me a Catholic. Very interesting. The people, he dedicated himself to studying the early writers of the church. And I'll just read one quote about being influenced by these early writers and his reading them. He spent the whole summer, one summer, just reading about after the New Testament times, the early writers of the Christian faith, of the Catholic faith. And he especially was attracted by the church in Alexandria, Egypt. At that time, Rome was not that influential, but the church in the East was very influential. And he says this: "The broad philosophy of Clement and Origen carried me away. Some portions of their teaching, magnificent in themselves, came like music to my inward ear, as if in response to ideas which, with little external to encourage them, I had cherished so long." So reading these writers was like music to him. They just touched him. And he said, this is what Christianity is about. And he begins to identify the common beliefs of the time and the sacramental, especially the sacramental dimensions of the church. And he looked around and he said, the church that I'm experiencing here in England at that time doesn't have that vitality. It's not alive. And it's compared to the early church, it's not alive. And of course, in England at the time, the Anglican Church was very much influenced and beholden to the king and the political establishment of England during the 19th century. And so there was a real tension between the church and the political world and the government. And he said, and there began to be, among his friends, he said, this shouldn't be. The church should be freer with regard to the society that it's in. Here's another quote that expresses what he was feeling. This is in the late 1820s, 1830. With the establishment thus divided and threatened, thus ignorant of its true strength, I compared that fresh, vigorous power of which I was reading in the first centuries. In her triumphant zeal on behalf of that primeval mystery, to which I had so great a devotion from my youth, I recognized the movement of my spiritual mother, the self-conquest of her ascetics, the patience of her martyrs, the irresistible determination of her bishops, the joyous swing of her advance, both exalted and abashed me. There was need for a second Reformation. So his reading really, it was really deep and characterized by feeling and affection and desire. And he began to write. He wrote his first book called The Arians of the Fourth Century, The Arians of the Fourth Century. It was about one of the early heresies of the church. And he finished that around 1833. And his friend, Harold Froude, invited him to go on a trip to Italy. And he went on a Mediterranean trip for a few months with Harold, who was ill at the time, and his father wanted to take him to the Mediterranean to help his recovery. But he went to Italy, and it really had an effect on him. It affected the feeling level of his life. And one description in one of them, he talks about, I was in Sicily, and I was walking along one morning and I heard singing. And I looked and I saw it was in a church, and I went into the church, and it was a group of people. He said it was the Mass. I didn't know it at the time, but it was very beautiful to see these poor people in a church singing in the early morning. So things were touching his heart. When he came back to England, he became the leader in a movement. So he was a quiet, he tended to be quiet as a young man, he tended quiet, but he became more and more a leader. He was ordained a priest in the Anglican Church, began to preach, and his sermons are still published today. There are 8 volumes of parochial and plain sermons. They're wonderful sermons. They're very strong. Talk about Lent. He really asks people to make a change in their lives and to be willing to change. And conversion was certainly the theme of his writing and his speaking. So much so that he began to write and say, well, maybe there's a middle way between Catholicism and Protestantism. And he wrote a book called The Via Media, The Halfway House. But he came to realize that that didn't work. And more in the 1830s, he began to think about Catholicism and Roman Catholicism. So much so that at the end of the 1830s, he was walking with someone who quoted a line from St. Augustine. He quoted a Latin phrase from St. Augustine, securus judicat orbis terrarum. The whole world of the faith is what securely judges in religious matters. In other words, there has to be a connection to the whole. And he did not find that in Anglicanism. And he found it in Roman Catholicism. But he did not want to be led by his feelings. He wanted to be led by his mind and his intellect. So it took him a few years. Eventually, he wrote a book called The Development of Christian Doctrine. And he published that in 1845. And a famous line in that book is, it's about the church changing with the culture and the times in order to be the same. To live is to change, and to be perfect is to change often. It's quite a line. To live is to change, and to be perfect is to change often. And he really shows how the church developed, came to new doctrines, new beliefs, new ways of doing things in order to be faithful to Christ. And as he finished that book in October of 1845, there was an Italian priest that was in the area, and he invited the priest to come to hear his confession, and he asked to become a member of the Catholic Church, a very famous moment in his life. October 1845. And it's really quite something when you think about it. You know, just imagine leaving everything that you've been brought up on, leaving your friends, your family. Some of his family wouldn't talk to him for some years. And it's really quite, especially during this season of Lent, you know, it's sort of a radical questioning of, hey, what is God? really want me to do? What's he asking me to do? And of course, he asked of John Henry Newman a great sacrifice. He was known as the best preacher and teacher in England. In those years, students would come to hear him preach on Sunday nights. And the administrators in the university got upset about that because they were all coming out to listen to him. And so they changed the meal hours to keep them from coming. So he was very well known. He's probably one of the best known preachers and teachers in England at the time. But he left all that and became a Catholic. Now, one of the interesting things about Newman's life, and then in the second part of his life, he wrote these books that have become classics. The Idea of a University, the book The Apologia Pro Vita Sua. That's the story of his own life. Someone had challenged him publicly and challenged his honesty. So he tells the story of his conversion and why he became a Catholic. And at the time, Catholics were a despised minority in England. Poor Irish for the most part. And so for someone Oxford educated, a member of the intelligentsia, as it were, for him to become a Catholic was quite something. And he founded the oratory mission in England and became really a parish priest eventually in Birmingham, England, a factory town. But before that, the Irish bishops had asked him to write this book and to found the Irish University in Dublin. But his life as a Catholic was not very happy. He once wrote, he had a lot of time because a lot of trouble. People suspected him. They suspected anybody from Oxford. The bishops gave him were not easy to deal with then. And anyway, so he suffered a lot. There was a lot of suffering in his life. And I put some quotes that sort of capture his spirituality, and I think some of them are very appropriate for this season of Lent and next week, Holy Week, and then celebrating the great feast of Easter. That's our great feast. These are some quotes from John Henry Newman. Maybe I could read a couple of them. And this is one that I've often seen on holy cards, and this has always meant a lot to me. God has a plan for my life. God has created me to do him some definite service. He has committed some work to me which he has not committed to another. I have my mission. I may never know it in this life, but I shall be told it in the next. I am a link in a chain, a bond of connection between persons. He has not created me for naught. I shall do good. I shall do his work. I shall be an angel of peace, a preacher of truth in my own place, while not intending it, if I do but keep his commandments. Therefore I will trust him. Wherever I am, I can never be thrown away. If I am in sickness, my sickness may serve him. In perplexity, my perplexity may serve him. If I am in sorrow, my sorrow may serve him. He does nothing in vain. He knows what he is about. He may take away my friends. He may throw me among strangers. He may make me feel desolate, make my spirit sink, hide my future from me. Still, he knows what he is about. And I think that captures a great deal of the spirit of John Henry Newman. He became a Catholic, as I mentioned, and then had some real differences with the bishops. And one of the differences was an article which he wrote called On Consulting the Faithful in Matters of Doctrine. In other words, something that Pope Francis is doing now in trying, in this notion of synodality, trying to see what's going on in our Catholic people, what's happening. And people at the time said, that's heretical. You know, the bishops make the laws, that's it, period. And John Henry Newman said, it's important to listen. It's important to listen to each other. You'll do your job better if you listen. And this is a quote, this is one of my favorite quotes. We have each the same secret. Perhaps the reason why the standard of holiness among us is so low, why our attainments are so poor, our own view of truth so dim, our belief so unreal, and general notions so artificial and external is this. We have each the same secret, and we keep it to ourselves, and we fear that as a cause of estrangement, which would really be a bond of union. We do not probe the wounds of our nature thoroughly, as did Augustine. We may clean the outside of things, we are amiable and friendly to each other in words and deeds, but our love is not enlarged. Our affections are straitened, which means narrowed, and we fear to let the communication begin at the root. And in consequence, our religion as non-interior is hollow. I think of that in thinking about Pope Francis emphasizing this notion of walking with one another and listening to one another. Why? Because you'll hear about the dying and the rising of Christ through the heartaches and the joys of one another. If we really were able to have a community in which we really shared ourselves, I think our religion would be deeper. It'd come more from our hearts if the idea of there's something about a small group where we're not afraid to say what's on our mind. And we have the courage to say what's on our mind. And we're accepted, even if we differ from each other. So, this last, and I won't talk much longer. I'm sorry to be talking so long, but I won't talk much longer. But this last one, I love this. Someone pointed this out to me. This next to last one. We walk to heaven backwards. We advance in the truth by experience of error. We succeed through failures. We know not how to do right except by having done wrong. We grope about by touch, not by sight, and so by a miserable experience exhaust the possible modes of acting, till naught is left but truth remaining. Such is the process by which we succeed. We walk to heaven backward. We drive our arrows at a mark and think him most skillful, whose shortcomings are the least. One of the wonderful things about Cardinal Newman is that he became a cardinal. In 1878, a new pope came to the fore, Pope Leo XIII. And I guess he had known about Newman. And he let it be known that he wanted. Newman was a parish priest at the time, member of this small community of the Oratory in Birmingham. But he had a name, and Pope Leo XIII said, "I'd like to make him a cardinal." And when he saw Newman came to Rome, and he said to Newman, "You know, they said you were too liberal." He said, "But I want you to be a cardinal in the church." And just a couple of years ago, he was named a saint. He had his faults. This is one thing that I was fortunate enough to work on. It's all the reasons for him being named a saint, a Catholic saint. And there were some people that didn't think he was a saint at all. They said he was, opinionated, and he could get angry at times and sensitive. And Father Boyer, that I mentioned before, this book I read years and years ago, 1958, Father Boyer said, "Who said that sensitive people can't be saints? Who said that people who are sometimes high-strung can't be saints? Yes, they can be. It's how we deal with the nature that we have that makes us holy, the nature that God has made us." So it was really Newman, when he was made a cardinal in 1878, he said, "The cloud has been lifted from me forever." He had lived under a cloud. Some people thought he was much too liberal. And the Second Vatican Council vindicated a lot of what Newman said, especially about the laity and the importance of the laity in the church. So anyway, his life is a life of Lent and Easter. He really dedicated himself to seeking God, to prayer, even fasting. As an Anglican, he fasted and prayed deeply, believed in God's presence in the community of the church, believed in the sacraments, believed in the structure of the church. And God blessed him and blessed his efforts. And his books are still being published. So his word is going out. That's what God's doing. God's word goes out in order that we may live the best lives we can live in the world that we exist, in which we exist today. He calls us to holiness, which sometimes means letting go of things, but it also means union with God in Christ and in the Holy Spirit. So I want to play the Notre Dame Folk Choir singing the song that he wrote, the poem that he wrote, "Lead Kindly Light." He wrote it in 1833 when he was on a boat coming home from Sicily. And maybe what we could do is just read it together, and then, if I can find it. I always bring too many notes. Okay, good. So maybe we could read it together, that way you can catch the words, and the choir changes the words a little bit, but it's the Notre Dame Folk Choir, And it was done during the pandemic. So what you see are 12 or 15 young people in different they're in their, one's in a car singing, and one's in several people in their room, in their homes, and so forth. But he wrote this in 1833, leaving Palermo, Italy on a ship to take him home to England at the beginning of the Oxford movement. So maybe we could all read this and then listen to the music. And lead, kindly light, mid the encircling gloom, lead thou me on. And I am far from home, lead thou me on. Keep thou my feet, I do not ask to see the distant scene, one step enough for me. I was not ever thus, nor prayed that thou shouldst lead me on. I love to choose and see my path, but now lead thou me on. I love the garish day, in spite of fears, pride ruled my will, remember not past years. So long thy power has blessed me, sure it still will lead me on, o'er moor and fen, o'er crag and torrent, till the night is gone, and with the morn those angel faces smile, which I have loved long since and lost a while. Let me mention that he had lost a young sister, Mary, whom he loved very much. At 10 years old, she died suddenly, and that's an allusion to the angel faces smile, which I have loved long since and lost a while. Mormon Tabernacle Choir also has a wonderful
Corn, sugar.
advertisements. But if you do look under YouTube, the YouTubes for Lead Kindly Light, you see a number of renditions of it. It's been delightful to talk to you, so I'm finished.
On behalf of everyone here, and especially our committee, I want to thank you for coming here tonight and telling us about the life of St. John Henry Newman. As a matter of fact, this prayer, the quote, "God has a plan for my life," I have actually found it personally really helpful in these hard times. I have several friends that are suffering some real hardships, and I give them a copy of this prayer to help them through. So thank you again. We have here some presents. We have a lovely orchid. And somewhere there's an envelope.
Thank you.
I'll help you.
I'm not too good.
And there's some cookies too.
I'm better with cookies than with plants. There is refreshments and a question and answer period downstairs right now. And also don't forget the free will offering at the back of the church to help offset our expenses. Thank you very much, and we'll see you downstairs.